Now we're going to look at configuring local security in Windows 10. Exactly what is local security? Well, in reality, local security might be anything that you do to try to secure the physical system, access to the system, either physically or over the network, monitoring that access to the system. Anything that falls under that heading or those headings could be considered part of local security. I mean, local security are preventive measures that we're going to put in place, configurations that we're going to set up so as to increase the security of the system overall. And so, all of that really applies. Now, what we're going to focus on here is something called the local security policy. The local security policy in Windows 10, as in its predecessors, is a collection of settings that can be applied to the local computer or can be applied via GPOs in Active Directory domain environments. It's going to help us to monitor or even prevent unauthorized logons, monitor for or prevent improper network access to a computer over the network, unauthorized or improper maintenance procedures, administrative tasks that are happening. So it's a collection of settings that just increase the overall security of the system as a whole. Typically, unless it's an exception, we're not doing something on an individual computer. But that is certainly possible. If you have a scenario, for instance, where a computer, you think somebody is logging on to another employee's computer at night, and you want to track to see if that's going to happen. You can't prevent a valid user account from logging on to a computer, but you can see if somebody's logging on deliberately to another employee's computer. And so that would be a scenario where, okay, it's just this one computer, and we're actually going to go into the local security policy and we're going to turn on auditing because it'll give us the ability to track that kind of activity. All right, so there are those exception scenarios, but I think most of the time, if we are making setting changes here, we're doing it in a domain environment, and that means we're going to be using group policy. And when and if local policies conflict with group policy, then the local policies are going to be overridden. Okay, so we just have to keep that in mind. A conflict is the same setting set differently. Okay, so enabled, disabled, different values. It's configured in the local but not configured in the group policy. That wouldn't cause a conflict. But if there are conflicts, it's going to be the domain policies that win. So it's just key for us to remember that. All right, so let's take a look at the local security policies. If you go into Control Panel, this is one way to get into it. We can go into Administrative Tools, and you have this link to local security policy that's in Administrative Tools, okay? Which just tells us, really, this is just an MMC snap-in. It's an administrative tool that you could plug into an existing MMC console, or you could create your own. And as I said, it is a collection of settings, and there are a lot of different settings in here. We're not going to hit every single one of these settings. I do want you to see, if I just go gpedit.msc, this is the group policy object editor, but this is pointed at what's called the local computer policy. Okay, so local computer policy, but if I expand computer configuration, Windows settings, and then security settings, what we're seeing there, of course, is the exact same thing. So the local security policy is actually just a subsection of the local computer policy. It's all of the settings related to security, and of course you've got this exact same thing when you go to a GPO, to a group policy object. In fact, in group policy object, you'll actually have a couple of additional categories there related to some other options like Wi-Fi profiles and things. Okay, so as I said, we're not going to go through everything here, but I do want to mention some of these. If you want to secure the login process, password policies can be used to do that. These are the defaults. Now, mind you, this is only relevant on a client computer if you're talking about local accounts. Domain accounts, the password policies that are going to apply to them are going to be configured in the domain for the domain controllers, because that's where the accounts reside. But if you're looking at securing local accounts, or maybe you want to lessen these requirements, because by default it's requiring complex passwords, and 7 characters is the minimum password length, and it's making them change it every 42 days. So I can see in some, where security is less of an issue, smaller environments, you might want to change those. Account lockout settings are not set by default, but you can go in and configure the threshold here. So if I specify the threshold, and it looks like maybe just because I'm not have admin rights, but if I specify the threshold at, say, 5 invalid logon attempts, then I'll be configuring the lockout duration and the lockout counter as well. Okay, the lockout duration is how long is it going to be locked out. And that's just if somebody mistypes a password. Then down under local policies, this is where we really want to focus. The audit policy and then security options, user rights. The auditing, these are auditing security related events. And so I had said something about being able to monitor for, say, improper network access. Well, I can do that by monitoring the logon events. Okay? If you want to know, you can open it up and it'll tell you exactly what this is doing. So this is generated when a user is logged on to the computer. Now, what it doesn't exactly tell you is that it's also going to track this even if it's a network connection. A network connection is considered a logon. So we can turn that on. Object access you could use if you wanted to track access to files and folders. And by track, I mean that if there are events in this particular category, what's going to happen is those events are then going to go into the security log. And in the security log, you can go, or an administrator can go, and view those events and see what happened. You're not actually stopping what happened in this case. Your permissions are meant to do that and your authentication processes. But if somebody is able to get through, you would at least have a record. Okay? Some of them are more relevant on a server, like account management, directory service access, even account logon. That's something that would be recorded on domain controllers. But here, privilege use is the exercise of a user right. So you've got a lot there, and you've actually got some advanced audit policies down below where you can control it even more. Then under user rights are unlike permissions. Permissions are for a particular resource. They grant the ability to utilize that resource, whereas user rights are for the whole system. Or if user rights are configured in a domain-based GPO, they're for the entire domain. And so the user right gives an ability to a user, like the ability to log on to the computer or to log on via remote desktop services, or to shut down the system or to back up files and directories. There's probably 50 in here roughly of these user rights, and they're granted to default accounts. But I can go in here and modify this, all right? So log on through remote desktop services, for instance, is the administrators and remote desktop users, and we could add some additional individuals. If you did want to, as a part of your kind of investigation, you see that somebody is logging onto a computer, you don't want them to be able to do that, then you can deny the ability to log on locally to a user, or you can deny it through remote desktop. The backup files and directories, restore files and directories, shut down the system. You can define who is capable of doing some of these things. And that might be to give somebody some additional rights, or it might be to take things away. And then we've got security options. The security options, there's a ton of them in here. They are at least categorized for us in that, that first word always kind of speaks to what it's doing. So you've got several related to the accounts. Should the administrator account be renamed? Is the administrator account disabled by default? Do you want to block Microsoft accounts? You can do any of those things. We've got some audit settings. There are several related to the login process. Okay, not displaying the last username. A message text or title for people logging in. The caching of logon settings is here. Some of that is, most relevant in domain environments. You have a lot related to network client, network server, network access. It's best probably not to mess with a lot of those. Most of them are compatibility type settings that you would have to turn on just in case you were in a really, really mixed environment with much older systems, so they're not overly relevant there. But the user account control can really help you tweak user account control. We're going to talk about that in a little bit, so I won't mention those now. But it's a collection of settings that you can configure on a particular computer, or you can configure these same settings in a domain environment. You know, if we do so based on particular scenarios, we really can help to increase the security of Windows 10.